a sub-lieutenant in the Royal Navy, was visibly shaking as he tried to come to terms with the desperate circumstances in which he now found himself. This was not a Nazi court. The men gathered in that half-lit room at the top of Colditz Castle on the 11th of March 1944 were all British officers, bent on a rough kind of justice. Some of the British officers had been defendants in the German court-martial system for infringements committed at Colditz, and were well aware of the rights of an accused soldier. They knew there were strict rules for the discipline of servicemen accused of breaking British military and civil law. The wartime protocols required a minimum of 3 officers to sit in judgment. In death penalty cases, the verdict had to be unanimous. The officer in charge of this British court-martial proceeding was Captain Richard Howe. It was Howe who had arranged for the defendant to be pulled from his bed and placed before the clandestine tribunal. Howe, a captain in the 3rd Battalion Royal Tank Regiment, had gallantly served with the British Expeditionary Force during the French campaign. Captured in June 1940, along with many of the other long-standing Colditz POWs, he had fought a desperate rearguard action in the evacuation of British and French troops from the French port of Calais, for which he had been awarded the Military Cross. After his capture, Howe was sent to Laufen Castle, southeastern Bavaria, which the German army had turned into an officers' prison camp, Oflag, short for Offizierslager 7C. Within 2 months, Howe and 5 other British officers, including the legendary World War II escapee Major Patrick Reed, had dug a 24-foot-long tunnel from the prison basement to a small shed adjoining a nearby house. The 6 British prisoners, dubbed the Laufen Six, escaped on the 5th of September 1940, only to be recaptured 5 days later in Rastatt, Austria. These were men for whom it was their duty, like every British officer, to try to escape. The determination of the Laufen Six to pursue freedom at almost any cost had earned them a transfer to Colditz Castle in eastern Germany, the first British officers to be sent there. One of their first acts upon arriving at the castle was to appoint Pat Reed to the position of escape officer. But Reed had no wish to spend the rest of the war helping other prisoners escape. He wanted his own chance at freedom. So, when in the spring of 1942 a reluctant Howe agreed to replace him as the British man in charge of escapes, Reed and 3 other British POWs waited just 4 months before slipping through the Colditz kitchens into the castle yard, forced their way into a cellar, squeezed through a narrow slit window, dropped down a grass bank, scrambled up a steep earthen terraced wall, and ran free out of the prison grounds. All 4 made successful home runs back to Britain, not forgetting to send a postcard to their comrades in Colditz once they had reached the safety of Switzerland. They would be the last British officers to escape from Colditz Castle. Many tried to follow them, but were thwarted before leaving the castle grounds, or were later captured and returned to the camp. Others made it no further than the perimeter walls, and one British officer was shot dead after clambering over the barbed wire fence and running for the wood. As escape officer, it was Howe's job to personally approve all these plans. But by the spring of 1944, such a lamentable escape record weighed heavily on his shoulders, particularly as he had an agreement with the senior British officer in the camp that he would not escape himself until 10 British officers had made home runs. After more than 2 years of helpless watching, as each of his meticulously organized escapes were foiled by the suspiciously well-informed Germans, Richard Howe was determined that nothing would upset his latest and most ambitious plan. So now, Howe found himself looking at a British naval officer who he believed intended to reveal to the Germans all the current crop of British escape plans, including the secret tunnel that had taken 6 months of back-breaking work to complete, which scores of men were now counting on as their best bet for rejoining the war. Howe stood and gestured for silence before reading out the charge of treason, and then reminding the assembled group that Lieutenant Walter Purdy was a spy sent by the Germans to betray his country. He added that when Purdy was confronted with these allegations, Purdy had admitted to being a traitor and a rat. But there was more at stake than just escaping. The Nazis had long suspected that the British POWs detained at Colditz